Well, this presentation is based upon a paper that I actually wrote in grad school at Lincoln University when I was pursuing a master's in educational leadership. And this was written in 2014. And the paper was entitled Increasing Retention of African American Teachers in Public Schools. But my topic, I kind of expanded on this idea and a lot of the ideas in this paper and kind of updated it to deal with methods for the recruitment and retention of African or African American teachers, just in general, but with an African-centered perspective and an African-centered approach. And actually, when I was reviewing this paper, I could have entitled it that back then. So again, some things I just want to put out there before I really start getting into the paper. I'm not going to read the paper verbatim, but I'm just going to highlight some points. And I am going to read a lot of the paper, but not all of it verbatim. So one idea is that there's no quick fix at all to the issue with the lack of African American teachers in public schools or charter schools. There's no quick fix to this. This is protracted work. This is a long-term effort that must be employed. And I know it's very popular to speak of the fact that the statistic that there are about 2% of public school teachers are African American males. And that's just dealing with the males. I know there are more females, but still, there aren't enough females for our children. Either. I don't know the statistics on how many females are, but there aren't enough of those, enough females either. So I also present this as a Pan-Africanist and as a person that has embraced Black nationalism and the type of Black nationalism that Malcolm X discussed in his Ballad on the Bullet speech. Thank you. In his Ballad on the Bullet speech from 1964 in Detroit, Michigan. So that's going to inform a lot of my positions and a lot of my outlooks. So also, I think another thing that I want to mention is that one of the mistakes I think that is often made in terms of education reform efforts, well, one mistake is that we're very concerned about reform. And as Kwame Nkrumah stated, reform oftentimes serves to just maintain the current system and actually make it stronger. Reform doesn't really change anything on a grand scale, right? It gives the impression that, things are really changing when just, there's certain concessions are made and certain modifications of the current system are made, but the current system remains in itself intact. Also, I want to mention another Pan-Africanist from the other side of the continent. How you doing? So I want to mention another Pan-Africanist from the other side of the continent, Julius Nyerere, from Tanzania, who wrote in Education for Self-Reliance. He talked about the fact that our education system has to be a result of or dependent upon what type of society we would like to see. So a lot of times, I know in America and in the Western society, it's as if the Western society and the way it functions is a standard and is intractable, but yet, reforms are attempted to be made within the education system. But first, we have to have some serious conversations about, what is the society that we would like to have? Do we want to keep the same society? Because if we want to keep the same society intact as it is, then the education system does not need to change. So because the education system is doing exactly what it has been designed to do. So if Black children are failing, that's what it's designed to do. If Black children are ending up in prison, then that's what it's designed to do. If Black children are dropping out, then that's what it's designed to do. So we really have to look at the society overall and decide what type of society we would like to see. And then we can then have some better conversations, some more efficient and effective conversations around what type of schools we would like to have, and then what type of teachers we would like to have within these schools. So again, as I said, I'm kind of updating this paper that I wrote in graduate school when I was a graduate student at Lincoln, pursuing a master's in educational leadership back in from between 2012 and 2015. So I wrote this paper in 2014. So I appreciate the opportunity to, be able to present some of these ideas. And so I'm just going to talk about some things. So for one, my teaching career has spanned about 13 years, all within the Philadelphia public school system. I've taught in public schools, I've taught in charter schools, and one of the things that issues that I've dealt with and that students deal with is the attrition rate of teachers. Now, it's interesting because, as I speak on this, because just recently, I just resigned from the school district of Philadelphia, right? So some people would say, some of my students were concerned, they were upset, or people would pose the question, you're giving this presentation on methods for recruitment and retention of teachers, but the school district of Philadelphia was not able to retain you. So one thing that the distinction has to be made, so I've left that particular school district, but I'm not leaving the field of education. What I've done is I've decided to kind of just go into a bigger classroom. You know, as Dr. Greg Carr at Howard University always states, the world is a classroom. And so what I plan to do is use, social media, use YouTube, use some internet outlets to still provide lessons in mathematics, because I've been a mathematics teacher for 13 years. I've also taught a history course in the past. I would like to give, the mathematics that the students need, also, the history where there's a great void, I would say, a dearth of knowledge, using those media outlets, and also dealing with, some homeschool collectives that I've become a part of this past school year, and also just starting some after-school programming, some Saturday programming, some Sunday programming, some summertime programming, but just, some institutional educational spaces outside of the current public schools and charter schools, because they're not serving our children in a way where, as the late John Henry Clark said, to motivate them and train them to be responsible handlers of power. So with that being said, in this paper, I wanted to propose to provide methods to promote the retention of African teachers in spaces and just in the field of education in general, in response to the socio-political climate of the world we live in. And I've tried to frame this position utilizing 4 major prospects. Number 1 being the training to become a master teacher is number 1. Number 2, the teacher as a revolutionary worker. Number 3, the teacher in loco parentis. I know that's a Latin term, but I try to expound on this in an African-centered context. And number 4, teachers as stewards of ancestral tradition. And my claim is that if these 4 aspects are emphasized among African teachers on a regular basis and in a thorough manner, there will be far greater job satisfaction, resulting in greater retention rates of teachers. And this can also serve to stimulate the recruitment of African teachers as well. And when I say African, I use African and African American interchangeably, because when I'm saying African, I'm talking about sisters and brothers of African descent. I write this paper from the perspective of an African teacher of African children. So it could be stated that it's anecdotally, but truthfully, many African teachers hit a proverbial wall between years 2 and 4 in the teaching field, where they feel like they're over it, or they wish to quit because the job they've signed up for are many times essentially civilizing savages, and they're recruited kind of to do colonial missionary work from a deficit orientation, where the youth are looked at, okay, there's something wrong with these black kids and we have to fix them, right? And that's kind of like the approach. And I know a lot of the programming and programs like Teach for America, and even like a lot of undergraduate pre-service teacher training programs, they kind of have this unwritten curriculum and this unspoken idea that these black children need to be fixed. These poor black kids, they need to be fixed. They need to be imparted, imbued with middle-class values, westernized values, Eurocentric values, so that they can be fixed. So I argue that they don't need to be fixed. If anything, it's the miseducation system that is actually more savage. And this system needs to be fixed. But actually, I would say this system can't be fixed. I think we just need to create our own system, for our own children. That's what I would argue. And I think that aspiring educators, if they're serious about this profession, they have to have a vastly different outlook. African children need master teachers. Short of master teachers in every classroom, there should be African teachers in pursuit of this goal in every classroom. A master teacher is able to achieve success through consistent demonstration of classroom expertise with children who have been predicted to fail. The term master teacher implies a mastery of content knowledge, along with the 4 domains from the Charlotte Danielson model of evaluation, such as planning and preparation, classroom management, instructional delivery, as well as professional responsibilities, right? African teachers must enter the profession with this goal of mastery in mind. Let us not conflate mastery with perfection, though. A teacher can never attain overall perfection, as all possible content knowledge cannot be accumulated by one individual. And with the ever-changing spectrum of student needs and concerns, also coupled with administrative demands, one is constantly rebuilding and honing his or her craft. Mastery is a sound goal, illustrating the pursuit of perfection by dedicated teachers, though. Often African people enter the teaching profession almost accidentally, having never had any serious intention of entering this field while matriculating through undergraduate institutions. I can attest to that. I was an example of that. I went to undergrad, I pursued a degree in finance, I earned a degree in finance, I went into a certain career as a bank examiner. I found that it wasn't a good fit for me, and honestly, I just needed a job. I was always good at mathematics through most of my schooling, And I took a chance, started out doing some tutoring through an agency, which led to substitute teaching, which led to long-term substitute teaching. And then at that point I said, I could, possibly become a teacher. I had a child on the way, so I needed a steady income source, flow of income. So I said, I could try this out, and maybe, hopefully, one day I could become good at this profession. And I at least think I'm better than I was when I started back in 2005. So, so I never had any serious, goal back when I was young. In fact, I would have never wanted to be a teacher, but I ended up becoming one, right? A lot of times economic demands and the lure of programs such as Teach for America entice many to enter the profession yearly. Many public schools desperate for a warm body to supervise children during the school day leads to the necessity of hiring underqualified people with a great deal of potential. To be honest, I think I was one of those people. I was underqualified at the time when I first started. And I think I learned how to teach from teaching my students. Learning how to, understand their learning styles, learning how to try to cater my teaching style to their learning style, and just learning how to be a leader within a classroom. Many of those employed in schools never make the transition from basic school employee to actual teacher, let alone master teacher. This has to become a consistent goal among many, even the TFA and also teaching fellows programs. And they must not allow themselves to get overwhelmed by the minutiae of administrative functions, such as disciplinary referrals, lesson plan writing and editing, student progress folders, et cetera, et cetera. These aforementioned items have importance, but too often they become like the focal point of teaching instead of serving a support function, aiding in the process of becoming a master teacher. So while still considered a noble profession, teaching for too many of us has become far less prestigious than it has been in years past. The profession is often exploited for remuneration with relatively short daily hours and extended summer vacations. This exploitation is accompanied by the concomitant exploitation of children, that one is responsible for educating. Many enter into fields such as medicine, law, accounting, engineering, etc., with aspirations of mastering their field or mastering their craft. This desire for and will toward mastery facilitates a perseverance that stimulates retention in these fields. If there is no goal of master teacher status, which must be supported by a presence of master teachers willing and able to train their replacements, it becomes easy to embrace mediocrity and essentially steal money by not expending the type of effort required to truly educate African students. A teacher should not be a hustler. Let that be the explicit domain of Wall Street bankers advancing rugged individualist capitalist principles. Their goal is accumulation of wealth by any means necessary, or secure the bag, right? And not the positive development of human beings. Even if Wall Street interests are increasing their presence in the educational arena, the pushes toward privatization of education, and Texas Instruments is trying to sell calculators, so we believe that we gotta all these school districts need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on calculators, or smart technology has to be sold. $5,000 smart boards need to be sold to schools, not really because the students will be educated better with them, but because that company will have a bottom line, I should say, if the school districts buy these things. Even though those Wall Street ideas are filtering into the educational arena, we should leave that for Wall Street, and we should be more focused on developing human beings. Becoming a master teacher must be a goal instilled in African teachers during their undergraduate training, if not earlier. Then teachers will be motivated to stay in the field at least until a certain level of mastery is achieved. At that time, there would still not be such motivation to leave the field, since the need for training of replacements will yield many opportunities for these master teachers to provide service. The socio-political orientation of teaching is critical for African students. African teachers charged with educating African students cannot enter the profession with a goal of offering a conservative education, or even a liberal one for that matter. To solve the problems of our communities, which is what education should be utilized for, our education must be composed of a revolutionary perspectives. This is something that Kwame Ture spoke about back in 1968, after he completed his work with SNCC, and he was involved with the Black Panther Party for self-defense. It is through this revolutionary perspective on education that we as African people can gain economic, political, and social power over our communities and selves. And this is also reflective of some of the ideas that Malcolm X spoke on in his speech, The Battle of the Bullet, which I mentioned earlier. Black nationalism basically consisting of being in control of the economics, the politics, and the social institutions of your community. And education speaks directly to this. And another legend of the Black Power era, Assata Shakur, She offered her analysis of schools in her autobiography, Asada, which makes this outlook very necessary. The schools we go to, she quotes in her text, Asada, the schools we go to are reflections of the society that created them. Nobody is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that that knowledge will help set you free. Schools in America are interested in brainwashing people with Americanism, giving them a little bit of education and training them in skills needed to fill the positions the capitalist system requires. As long as we expect America's schools to educate us, we will remain ignorant. That's from Asada, by Asada Shakur. If in the meantime, African students must be subjected to European-centered schools, some of us must infiltrate these spaces as African teachers. While in these schools, we can impart the revolutionary perspectives necessary for our children to be empowered to have agency over their existence. This type of revolutionary education is not to be confused with something romantic that was best left in the late 1960s with the Black Fist of Kwame Ture shouting Black Power. Black Power is an important concept, but it must be made more tangible. It can't be just romantic or just a lofty ideal. This concept cannot be reduced to a cliche, and if it has been, it should be resurrected in a more useful form for the sanctity and survival of our children and communities. This revolutionary outlook applied to all aspects of African existence, especially education, is needed now more than ever. An African teacher that enlists in this type of work will be more likely to be invested in the protracted nature of this struggle for our humanity and not be easily deflated by the trials and tribulations of public school culture. When numerous African people converged upon rural Mississippi and other southern locales in the 1960s as members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the Nonviolent Action Group, NAG, they anticipated these challenges. So when these activists were in freedom schools teaching, they were well aware of these challenges, and when confronted with the typical daily challenges, they were less likely to capitulate because they kind of knew what they were getting into. So one of the things I argue is that if teachers or potential teachers are made to be aware that this is the real type of work that you're doing, like this is what you're up against, this is the system that we're working against, then it's like you know what to expect. It's like you go into a fight with somebody, okay, you expect you're gonna get punched in the face. So when you get punched in the face, you're not just gonna run away immediately because you knew that was gonna happen, right? Many did leave the ranks of organizations like SNCC later, but even more could have left had they not recognized the value of the revolutionary work they were doing. And when SNCC ended, SNCC basically dissolved as an organization, a lot of them continued on in their work. People such as Kwame Ture, Donna Richards, who's changed her name to Marimba Ani, they continued on the work. Bob Moses, Charles Cobb, they continue with this work. We as stakeholders must be able to inform and train African teachers in the context of revolutionary workers of times past. We need to develop African teachers with a mindset similar to that of like a Chokwe Lumumba from the Republic of New Africa, who later became, more recently, before he passed away, became the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And now his son is the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. People such as Fred Shuttlesworth from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or Gloria Richardson, another member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. African teachers have to approach this profession with more of a concern for liberation of African people through true education and less concern for high stakes testing. So it's like, I think also, like I spoke earlier about us, considering like Julius Nyeri and his words, and us considering first and foremost the type of society we want to see before we talk about what type of schools we want to have or what type of teachers we want to have in these schools. Well, I think also we have to have some serious conversations and explicit, very detailed theoretical conversations about what education is for. It's like education, like Drake has a famous song, "Nice for What?" I think we have to have education for what conversations. Like for what? Because education is a term that just gets thrown around real loosely. Even if you ask students, you say, well, what do you come to school for? To get an education. Okay, they get an education to do what? To get a job or to be successful. But what does that really mean? And I think we have to really unpack that. As adults, we have to unpack it. And then, with the youth, we definitely have to unpack that as well and have these like explicit conversations. So with an emphasis on liberation, high stakes testing becomes secondary and will be conquered easily by our students when viewed and approached properly. The revolutionary education that African children not only require but deserve is paramount to Common Core standards generated and enforced by departments of education on the local, state, and federal level. The revolutionary education is concerned with how to use these standard concepts to gain power. Again, as John Henry Clark stated, the purpose of education is to train our children to be responsible handlers of power, right? To gain power in this society and catalyze a paradigmatic shift within and without America's borders. Currently, the curricula of the vast majority of schools serve conservative or liberal interests that at best provide token opportunities for Africans to promote and maintain the structure of white supremacy capitalism and not themselves. The power in America is concentrated in the hands of this white power structure, which has the ability to control African communities from outside, much like apartheid South Africa. So much like Soweto in 1976 or Philadelphia in 1967, African students must rise up and demand a more meaningful education while in these schools. And this should all be facilitated by African teachers as guides on the side, helping the children to reach this full potential, this revolutionary political potential. Being a revolutionary in the classroom can draw many similarities to a soldier on the battlefield. The African teacher is not battling against the students, but many times, well, it may seem like that, but they should be battling against this white power structure for the minds of our African children. As Chairman Mao Zedong stated, there are only two ways to leave the battlefield, dead or victorious. As a classroom teacher, leaving the profession and his or her children behind in the classroom may approximate death to some, and we should want victory and nothing short of it. The African teacher must be war ready. This war readiness is of the type that the late Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop requested of African people to have in their involvement in a larger project to regain our African humanity. Because what he issued a call, for African people to be pluridisciplinary scholars that would aid in this work of regaining our African humanity globally, on a global basis. So moving on to this other domain. In undergraduate education coursework, the Latin term in loco parentis is introduced, meaning that the teacher will serve as a surrogate parent while students are on school grounds and under the teacher's supervision. Within an African cultural framework, there is no separation between parent and teacher. As a teacher, one should embrace the role of parent in order to supplement the efforts of biological parents and other relatives. This is another commitment that can be made by African teachers toward the lives of African students. If we view teaching African children in the same manner we view optimally raising African children, we will be on a path to much greater results. Even if a particular teacher is not a parent themselves, there should be a human instinct in all of us that enables us to show the care and concern to a student that a parent shows to a child. Since true education also includes a socialization process, usually administered and managed by parents, the African teacher should be equipped for and optimistic about this responsibility. As a consequence of the popular socialization process, too many of us see education as essentially a preparation for jobs, as a preparation for moving up in social status, and as a means of securing a better lifestyle. While these are some of its major functions, these should not be the primary functions of education. The major function of education is to help secure the survival of a people and the thriving of a people, because we have to move, at some point we do have to move past the survival to the mode of thriving, right? We can't always be in survival mode. Through the proper socialization of African children by African teachers, this can be achieved. A more appropriate term than in loco parentis would be Kendesi. Kendesi from the Congo is an art focused on the nurturing of the young, and this is from Dr. Foucault's work, Congo and the Art of Babysitting, is an art focused on the nurturing of the young within the society as well as the growth of the Ndesi, known as the caretaker practice in the art of Kendesi. This definition is important because it speaks to the reciprocal nature of students being developed while teachers are simultaneously developed through practice. As I mentioned earlier, I learned how to be a good math teacher. I mean, people have told me I'm a good math teacher, but I learned how to be a good math teacher from teaching my students. My students taught me how to teach them, so I've learned through them. The Kendesi enabled parents, specifically mothers, to tend to management of farmland on a large scale in pre-colonial Africa. A simpler translation of Kendesi is the art of babysitting, but not to be confused with the reductive European context of babysitting. While an insignificant activity in the European culture, babysitting or Kendesi is the greatest honor that can be bestowed upon a person in African society. This further goes to impress upon us the contrast between African and European societies, and that the former is child-centered while the latter often devalues children in childhood. And we can see that from the condition of how schools are, how schools are allowed to be. So there's this, this devaluing of children and youth just in general. We as African people are exerting our best efforts with the limited material resources we have in order to survive in a European-centered society, with most of our children enrolled in European-centered schools. If African teachers concern themselves with primarily protecting our children from the evils of these institutions in much the same way a parent or a Kendesi would, this can enhance teacher retention rates because it presupposes an emotional investment not easily abandoned, right? And I also plan to increase some awareness by using, again, as I mentioned earlier, using the internet, because I've left the school district of Philadelphia, but I plan to use like, the internet, YouTube, and other social media resources, because I still have that. I'm still emotionally invested, like, in my students. Like, matter of fact, two of my students, my 10th graders from this past year, they were in my one of my geometry classes. They have a podcast, and they invited me to come, speak on their podcast and basically just, talk with them. And I enjoyed that. I just did that this past Wednesday. So like that emotional investment is still maintained. And I've also maintained relationships with, students that I've had, throughout the past 13 years. Because I learned at one point that, from another elder teacher years back, that, she said some words that really resonated with me. That, she said, once I'm your teacher for life. So really, this concept of being like, a former student is actually like a misnomer. It's like I really don't have any former students, even though in certain contexts I may use that term, but I really don't have former students because, I would like to be able to, provide and look out for you, like, regardless, like, forever, as long as it's possible.
Hey, bro, where do you teach, brother? Because I used to live in Philly.
I was teaching at Overbrook for the past 2 years.
Overbrook, okay. So
Yeah.
West Philly.
Yeah, I was over there.
Yeah, West Philly, cool.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
We can talk about that.
Yeah.
So, African teachers can serve as stewards of ancestral tradition. African people have always valued scholarship and high intellectual practice from ancient Kemet, or Egypt, on through the 21st century throughout the African diaspora. More recently, due to overwhelming power imbalances and a loss of cultural continuity, education has been devalued and used mainly as a tool for, as I stated, attaining employment, resulting in the purchase of commodities and services in order to support capitalist consumerism. And in the African context, education has always been a spiritual practice, foundationally enabling our people to historically regard the educational space as a sacred space, much like a church or a masjid. Our African history is replete with examples of men and women perpetuating this ancestral tradition of educating our people. We can reference the oldest book in the world entitled The Teachings of Ptah Hotep, first published in ancient Kemet in 2388 BCE before the Common Era, or during the 5th Kemetic dynasty. This text was an instructional manual for life in general. Egyptian priests such as Eunuphus taught in Heliopolis and taught the well-known Greek Pythagoras, for whom the Pythagorean theorem is named. Incidentally, the Pythagorean theorem is a misnomer in itself because this hypotenuse right triangle rule had been in use in ancient Kemet for over 2,000 years prior to Pythagoras, to his existence. African math teachers and students alike should be emboldened by this type of knowledge, and students should be motivated by these facts to do better in courses such as in mathematics courses, geometry, algebra, whatever. So much later in the 19th and 20th centuries, examples of this educational tradition abound. So I'm gonna highlight a few here. Frederick Douglass, while still enslaved, organized and ran what was essentially a guerrilla literacy center on a plantation he lived on in the eastern shore of Maryland. Later in the 19th century, one of Douglass's unofficial students was Ida B. Wells, who was an established and successful school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee for many years. This was foundational work that informed the balance of her life work as a newspaper editor and writer, historian, and organizer. W.E.B. Du Bois, a contemporary of Miss Wells, also was an established teacher from his summers in rural Tennessee while on break from Fisk University up through his professorships at both Wilberforce and Atlanta University. And he was still doing that work in Philadelphia, when he was doing his sociological and anthropological study, which became the Philadelphia Negro in 1898, which was published. Even though University of Pennsylvania basically played him, didn't respect his scholarship and didn't respect his status. But we can talk about that another time as well. Mary McLeod Bethune taught and subsequently used her talents to found a school which is today Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona, Florida. Anna Julia Cooper and Dr. Carter G. Woodson were both instructors and administrators at the M Street School in Washington, D.C. during the early 20th century. This school still functions today as the well-known Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. Lucy Craft Laney, much like Mary McLeod Bethune, was the founder and principal of Haynes Institute in Augusta, Georgia for 50 years. All of these figures were primarily teachers and a part of a society of individuals interested in uplifting our African race through education despite different methodologies employed. The African teachers should strive to be affiliated with individuals of this caliber and can do so by participating in this type of work that they did. In 2014, the need for racial uplift remains prevalent, especially since so many falsely believe that it is unnecessary due to insidious fantasies of the post-racial society being strewn about by major media outlets and ignorant and not so ignorant white supremacy apologists of African descent. So, but those people like Mary McLeod Bethune, Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, like tapping into those people, that kind of speaks to like an analytical framework that I've been thinking about, which I call geographic exemplar of replacement. So I believe that there's a such thing as geographic exemplar displacement, where these important type of figures that are from certain cities, whether it be Memphis, Tennessee, Ida B. Wells, you have to remove Ida B. Wells from history and make her obscure, so the young people will have heroes like Yo Gotti. Right? Yo Gotti becomes a hero if you're from Memphis, Tennessee. But Yo Gotti becomes less influential and less important if you know about people like Ida B. Wells, right? You know, like let me see, like Douglass. You know, there are plenty of people from the Maryland area, Baltimore area, that, you know, but Douglass was on the Eastern Shore. Douglass was doing work in Baltimore at the same time, did a lot of work there. But you have to remove Douglass, even though Douglass is a famous name, is maybe a household name. One of the people that, you know, is often repeated during Black History Month, but do we really know about Douglass? Like, we don't really know about him because we really, like a lot of our children have not read the first autobiography they published in 1845, or his second autobiography from 1855, or his third autobiography, The Life and Times, I think published in like either 1878 or 1881. So you have to remove these people. So what I advocate for is something called geographic exemplar replacement, where we pull these people out of obscurity and make them the representatives and the exemplars of these geographic locations. Because naturally, as people, myself and a lot of us, we like to identify with people that are from where we're from. Or we like to identify with people that are where we are at. Like right now, like we flew into Jacksonville yesterday, and I remembered in the past when I came to Florida, not to Jacksonville specifically, but I was doing some research on T. Thomas Fortune, and I found out that T. Thomas Fortune, who also had a newspaper, the New York Age, either New York Age or the New York World, he spent time in Jacksonville. So, you know, him being a representative. So now I'm in the city of Jacksonville. I feel like, you know, I'm thinking about T. Thomas Fortune. You know, I'm thinking about like him and the work that he did. So I think this is something that we should do. We can use these geographic examples to present to the children, to the youth, and not just the youth, but to us as adults. And we can, like, you know, pull these people out of obscurity. Because a lot of these people either haven't even heard of their names, or they've heard their name and they're very popular, but a lot of the stories around them have been sanitized, and there's been a lot of revisionist history that they fell victim to, you know, to maintain a certain narrative. In Philadelphia, where I live, there have been major figures continuing this ancestral educational tradition. Two such figures I think are very important were the late Marcus Foster and Queen Mother Annie D. Hyman. These individuals affected the education of many African youth and adults in the city. Marcus Foster was a public school teacher and a later principal at Simon Gratz High School during the 1960s, who had a lasting effect on African youth in Philadelphia. This type of exemplar is very much needed today. His attitude and behavior as a school principal still resonates with elderly Simon Gratz alumni to this day. Queen Mother Annie D. Hyman migrated from Alabama with a deeply inculcated understanding of the value of education, which will culminate with her founding the Pan-African Studies Community Education Program in 1975, which is housed on Temple University's campus. PASEP, what is called, with the acronym PASEP is used to describe it, in the face of many challenges, is still in existence today. And I'm proud to claim that I've had the opportunity to teach, at first, a GED mathematics course there back in 2011 for a few years. And now I teach a transitional math course there, which is supposed to be like a college algebra type course meant to prepare students that have recently taken a GED for entrance into college. And also I'm going to be teaching a course on Kwame Ture this fall called Kwame Ture Speaks, based on the text Stokely Speaks, which has about 15 of his most famous speeches and lectures within it. Carrying on tradition is an essential aspect of African culture, and all cultures for that matter. Without continuance, the culture becomes extinct. A major problem that we as Africans have is that we have been divorced of our authentic culture, and at times given caricatures of it by our oppressors. This has precipitated an historical amnesia among us that has left us susceptible to the investment of unhealthy practices within us by outside forces for the purpose of controlling our people for their gain. The African school teacher can and must be the ambassador of our cultural traditions that served us maybe imperfectly, but well, for thousands of years. He or she can help us to regain our authentic culture and truly progress as a people. Without this embracing of our culture, we are destined to receive white power structured concessions masquerading as progress that actually enhances our oppression. In light of the challenges that African children face while quote unquote behind enemy lines at European-centered schools, teachers can serve as a buffer between the children and their destruction, pending a massive exodus of our children into independent African-centered schools. Teaching within these circumstances is a calling and much more than a job with a bi-weekly paycheck and benefits package. As with all things, in order to promote teacher retention in this work, it must be marketed effectively by the appropriate people that have a vested interest in the development and maintenance of the humanity of our children in a society that works diligently to dehumanize them at every turn. Among other things, the prospects of becoming a master teacher in an African context, being a revolutionary worker, teaching as a parent, and continuing ancestral tradition can serve to attract and maintain these women and men in teaching positions in the schools our children inhabit. African people in general must be mindful of the education our children are subjected to. The African teacher invested in the uplift of his race must be a first responder to address these educational concerns. Carter G. Woodson addresses this issue of the value of this education that African teachers have often delivered. And this is taken from the Miseducation of the Negro. The only question which concerns us here is whether these educated persons are actually equipped to face the ordeal before them or unconsciously contribute to their own undoing by perpetuating the regime of their oppressor. The so-called modern education, with all its defects, however, does others so much more good than it does the Negro because it has been worked out in conformity to the needs of those who have enslaved and oppressed weaker peoples. For example, the philosophy and ethics resulting from our educational system have justified slavery, peonage, segregation, and lynching. The African teacher must focus on this reality in order to advance our youth and our people at large. So they also, before I close out, there are like these 5 different approaches that I think we can also take to deal with recruitment and retention of African teachers in the field of education generally. So one is, I just want to just come out and say, I think we just need to build and maintain independent schools. I'm convinced, like, this system and these schools are not meant to work for us. They're not meant to benefit us. So we have to begin to do the work that, some are doing currently, and our ancestors did because when we had to do it, because we were denied, the resources, so we had to just do for self. So we had to build and maintain independent schools, and we had to figure out how to fund these schools. I just finished reading this text called "We Are an African People," written by Russell Wickfield, where he documents the history of independent black schools throughout the United States, from coast to coast. And one of the main issues there was government repression, of course, but one of the main issues was how to fund these institutions. I mean, there even was a college. It was a college started by the brother Howard Fuller. Howard Fuller out of, I want to say, is it Milwaukee? Yeah, I think he's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was in North Carolina at the time. He founded Malcolm X Liberation University, like in 1969. And it was an actual college. It only lasted for 4 years, but it was an actual college. And you just had to be a member of the community. That's it. And you had the one education. And at first it was in Durham, then it relocated to Greensboro, not too far from North Carolina A&T and Bennett. But Malcolm X Liberation University. So this has been done. It's been done before, and I think we just have to start spreading more propaganda and having positive propaganda and having conversations about developing these independent institutions. Because I know a lot of times it probably seems insurmountable. It seems like that we may not be able to do this, but we can do it, and we have done it in the past, and we need to do it again. Number 2, as I kind of alluded to during the talk, is that we have to make potential teachers aware that this is not colonial missionary work. This is not sweet. Lerone Bennett, the late Lerone Bennett Jr., historian and also editor of Ebony magazine, he has a famous quote, the teacher is either going to be a tyrant or a liberator. Essentially, the teacher is going to be a tyrant or a liberator, a tyrant that maintains an oppressive status quo, or he's going to liberate children. He or she is going to liberate children. Right? Constant reading, of those that, again, if we see these examples, see these exemplars, and people that have had these conversations about education for liberation, and not necessarily education for assimilation, cultural assimilation, then this will seem more realistic to us. This type of work. Constant reading of those that spoke on education for liberation, such as the W.E.B. Du Boises, the Carter G. Woodsons, the Juwanza Kajufus, the John Henry Clarks, the Ida B. Wells Barnetts, the Assata Shakurs, the Barbara Sizemores, Paulo Freire, Dr. Adelaide Sanford, Asa Hilliard, Jacob Carruthers, Kwame Ture, Bobby Wright, Amos Wilson, just to name a few. You know, these people had to be studied because they heavily researched, heavily documented, you know, a lot of information about education that we can use. It's very useful. And our children need to know about these people as well and their work. I think we need to create a conveyor belt. William Roden, in his book, $40 Million Slaves, where he talks about the history of the black athlete in America, he talks about this conveyor belt where, you know, children, you know, a lot of grown men that end up playing for the NFL or the NBA, they're kind of put on this conveyor belt when they're very young. You know, like in Little League or in Pop Warner, and with this end, then they go to high school and it's still, you know, more football. In college, more football, and then they go to the pros. I think we need to start doing that in our community, like identifying young sisters and young brothers and say, okay, we're gonna need you to be a teacher. And I think we may have to get away from some of the individualistic liberalism that we kind of have, where we kind of like let our children just experience life and do whatever. Because we're really, as black people, we're in a state of emergency. John Henry Clark talked about Japan after World War II. After World War II, Japan was essentially decimated, you know, but then you have so that's like in the 1940s, they essentially decimated, but then we fast forward to like 1980, everything that we're buying in America, almost everything is Japanese. The Japanese were able to rebound. You know, we're buying Honda Accords, we're buying Toyota Camrys, you know, we're buying Nissans. Every appliance is Sony, this, Sony that. You know, people still buying PlayStations today because Japan came together and looked at their situation collectively and said, listen, we need 10,000 engineers. We need 10,000 oceanographers. We need 20,000 math teachers. Like, this is what we need as a collective. This is what we need as a community and as a people, because we need to come back up because, you know, we're in a bad situation right now. You know, so I think we need to create conveyor belts. I mean, we look at, like I mentioned, athletes. I mean, what about drug dealers? You know, grown men that are drug dealers often are on that conveyor belt as well. They start out young, involved in the drug trade, involved in the drug culture, you know, and they graduate, you know, to higher levels, you know. Even rappers, you know, they start out young. You know, doctors, lawyers, engineers, you know, they start out young, get exposure to certain different types of programming, and then put on conveyor belts. And I think we need to do this with education. I think with teaching, much like myself, I never wanted to be a teacher. I kind of just fell into it accidentally. But I think we need to be create programming, you know, we can be more intentional even with young people and, you know, create spaces where it's like, you know, okay, we need for you to be a teacher and start pushing some of our best and brightest, you know, in the classrooms, you know, to become teachers, you know, despite the challenges. But as I said, like, you know, prepare them for the challenges and let them know what they're up against, that, you know, this is supposed to be difficult, you know, because we're not, you know, this is really revolutionary work, and revolution is not easy at all. And last but not least, I would say that, like, teachers, like the school itself, must be fixtures within the community, connected to parents, grandparents, local businesses, etc. So I think that's what has to happen. You know, because then again, it's not just a job if you're doing that. Because now you're part of the community, and, you know, so you lean on the community leans on you, and we all work together, and there's a lot of cohesion there, I think. So these are just some of my ideas about some methods that I've been, you know, just dealing with, and a lot of thoughts I've had based on my own personal experiences of being a teacher for 13 years, and just a lot of things I've observed and experienced, and you know, some potential methods, you know, from an African-centered worldview and in an African-centered context of how to increase the you know, recruitment as well as the retention of African or African American school teachers. Thank you.
Thank you.